All right, so I was in America. I had a chance to go to Portland, Oregon, and I thought, oh, Kevin Burke lives in Portland, Oregon. I'm going to get his phone number. I'm going to phone him up and ask him if he'd do an interview.
How did that go for you?
He said, I'm just out walking the dog. But he said, I'll be home in a minute and I'll check my diary, but I don't think I've got anything on tomorrow, so come on over. And that's what I did. So that's today's episode. An interview with Kevin Burke, member of the Bothy Band, legendary Irish fiddle player, one of the most, as you'll hear, one of the most exquisite players that you could ever hear, and a lovely, generous, warm individual. So that's today's episode.
Kevin is actually also performing in Drogheda during the Flacciol on the 16th of August in the Highlands. I think it's about 10 p.m. If there are any tickets left, get yourself one. It will be an absolute treat. Last thing before we get into the interview is just another note on Patreon. To anyone that went over to patreon.com/Blarney Pilgrims last week and became a patron for us, thank you so much. That means the world. If you're listening to this for the first time, Patreon is a website which allows you to become a patron of the arts. And let's say this podcast is the arts. Essentially what it does, it means we don't have to go looking for advertisers. We don't need to stop the podcast and advertise something. We don't need to recopy at the end and all that kind of stuff, right? That's something we never wanted to do. But we do want to have a community grassroots organization that can maybe fund itself. If you want to help us do that, head over to patreon.com/Blarney Pilgrims. Those few shillings will go a long way to help us keep on producing this.
Absolutely. And now, Kevin Burke. So you grew up you were born in London. Where were you?
Cockney. I'm an actual Cockney.
An actual...
Yeah, I was born within the sound of Bow Bells.
You were?
Yeah. Hackney Hospital.
What was your address?
Well, I wasn't living in Hackney. Our address was in Charlton, South London, just across the river from Hackney. 105 East Combe Avenue, Charlton, London, SE7. And we didn't have a phone, so I don't have a phone to remember.
So what did your mum and dad do? So they were were they from Sligo?
Yeah. But both my parents were from Sligo. My father left to join the Navy in the Second War. And after the war, he went to Palestine as a member of the Palestine police when they were, the Brits were setting up Israel. They were given the job of setting up this new country, Israel. So he was part of the Palestine police until 1948, when the Brits left and Israel became its own place. And in the meantime, my mother, who grew up probably 7 or 8 miles from my father's village, his village was called Dromore West. My mother had moved into that village to help her brother set up a tailor shop. So I presume that's when they met. My father was home on leave, or he left the police or whatever. That's when they met first. And then when the Palestine police was disbanded, he joined the London police, moved to London. And not long after that, my mother moved to London as well to continue her tailoring career. She worked in a big department store called Barker's in Kensington. And then they got married in 1949, and I was born in 1950. And I came a few weeks early, so that's what my father was working in the East End, so I don't know, was she over visiting him or over as part of her work? She used to work with some of the Jewish tailors in the East End. But anyway, she wasn't quite ready for me to be born, but all of a sudden I was on the way, so they had to go to the nearest hospital, which turned out to be Hackney. So I'm a bona fide Cockney.
What took your dad into the Navy? That's kind of interesting, because as an Irishman kind of joining the British Navy.
The wartime, the war effort. His dad was in the Navy in the First War. His dad was kind of a career Navy guy, but also a Sligoman.
We're talking about the British Navy here?
Yeah. Derry was one of the ports. My father's Navy career was mainly on the North Atlantic convoys. So Derry would be a port they'd use a lot. And officially, as British servicemen, they weren't supposed to go into the south. But unofficially, any time they dock in Derry, all the Irish blokes would be given leave. And, you know, it was understood they'd all go home, you know. So that's where they went, even though it was not strictly lawful, you know. But it was just an understanding, you know.
So what was your when you think about growing up in London? What was it like? Was it a happy time for you? Do you?
I was an only child till I was 13, so I felt lonely a lot. But I couldn't say it was unhappy. But I do remember my mother working hard, because she worked at home a lot of the time. I remember the hours she'd put in with the tailoring. You know, it was hard work. And my dad was a cop doing shift work, so that wasn't easy either. And he was still in the East End, so every day he'd cycle through Blackwall Tunnel to Poplar or Bow or wherever he was stationed, Stepney. And cycle home. He was very fit. He was a bit of an athlete. So when he wasn't working, he'd be doing training, going to events at weekends, and but it was a shift work thing. You know, he'd have night duty and he'd be gone in the morning and then home in the evening, and sometimes it'd be the other way around. He'd be there in the morning, but he would be gone in the evening. And he was one of those guys that kept a lot of it outside the home, you know. And of course, when I got to be a bit older, I could see why. He didn't want to be bringing stuff, you know, police work home, because a lot of especially in the East End, it was pretty rough. You know, he was a cop. You probably heard of the Cray brothers. You know, they were neighbours. He used to actually see them across the road sometimes when they were kids. He knew the mum and dad, and knew the whole family, and so there was that kind of respect for lawlessness. You know, if you were a cop, you were already the opposition. But at the same time, there was a kind of he liked it. He actually liked it. There was a rivalry between the villains and the cops, but there was an understanding. And in fact, when he retired, for a short time, he became manager of an Irish dance hall in Fulham. And one night he got a call. There was a lot of trouble, apparently, in the club, or suspected trouble. People were getting alarmed, and it turned out all these villains from the East End had shown up. And it turns out, far from causing trouble, they were there to see if he needed a hand, in case there might be trouble. So he had to tell his villain friends, you know, thanks, but clear off. You're not welcome round here.
So what about yourself then? So you're growing up. You don't see him that. No, of course not. No.
He's a good boy. No, I went to Catholic school, and you know, brought up Catholic, and it was a lower middle class upbringing. The first house, or the first place we lived, that place in Charlton, it was an upstairs flat, And there was an older couple in the downstairs flat. It was just 2 flats, one on top of the other. And of course, they'd be complaining about me. I was a kid, I was kicking football and jumping up and down and making noise. And they were older people. They didn't like noise, The railway ran at the back of the house. It was an area that was heavily bombed during the Blitz, so there were big cracks in the sides of the walls and stuff. I remember I used to hide stuff in the crack. I could get my hand in, my little childish hand could fit in the crack. So I'd hide stuff like chewing gum and, sweets and things that I wasn't supposed to have, maybe. But the parents did a great job, really. And then when I was 13, when I was about 9 or 10, we moved out a bit to a place called New Eltham. And the house at the time was in Kent. It was literally about 20 yards over the border into Kent. Now, of course, it's all part of Greater London. But it was a semi-detached house, suburban house. And then when I was 13, I had a sister, and soon afterwards, 2 more brothers. So the last fellow was born when I was about 17, and then when I was 18, 19, I left to go to college and go around the place. So I was more like an uncle to them than a brother, really. Mm-hmm. But it became a busy house instead of a quiet house, And the Irish thing. A couple of the teachers I had were Irish, but bringing the fiddle to school was kind of odd. It was a sissy thing, and I got a bit of flack for it, but not a lot, because in my school you got flack whether you liked it or not. If you had freckles, you'd be teased about having freckles, and if you didn't have freckles, you'd be teased about not having freckles. It was a no-win situation. Everyone got harassed, and there was always, every day in the school, there was a scrap. 2 or 3 guys would get into it, and rough and tumble, but the teacher would come and start yelling and grab you by the ear and tell you to grow up, and that'd be the end of that.
So where was the seed of the music for you at this point when you were a youngster?
My parents both loved traditional music. They didn't play themselves, but my father's father played, and his mother's sister played. On my mother's side, she had an uncle, Pádraig Malarkey, who was a really great fiddler. I never met him, but anyone I ever met who knew him, almost the first thing they'd say about him was, "God, did you ever hear that fella play the fiddle? What a great fiddle player he was." Mm-hmm. But he was kind of a recluse, he didn't go out much. But all the local people would know him as a great fiddler. So there was music in the family. My parents loved it. They'd always be going to dances, ceilidhs, and sessions in pubs, and they'd bring me. And often people would come to the house. Other people living in London would come to the house, and there'd be sessions in the house. And because my dad was a cop, I suppose, and respectable guy, he didn't drink, and my mother didn't drink. So when there'd be young people coming over from Ireland, their parents would often send them to us as this kind of safe house for them to find their way in London. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those people, again, came from Sligo, Mayo, and would be players, mm-hmm. teenage players, or people who liked music. So I just grew up with it around the house. And records. My father, when he left Palestine, he got what they used to call the mob money, kind of a lump sum. And he spent it all, I think, on a record player and some records. And all those records were Sligo fiddlers, mainly. Mm-hmm. Coleman, Killora, James Morrison, Hughie Gillespie, a few other things, but those records were played all the time in the house.
So that was weaving its way into your into your head.
And when I was 7 or 8, I started taking fiddle lessons. My parents weren't musicians, so they sent me to a music teacher who happened to live down the street, classical teacher. And she was a real fascinating woman, very wealthy.
What was her name?
Kristofferson was her maiden name. Gibson was her married name, but she always went by Kristofferson, Jessie Kristofferson. And she, her family was very wealthy. I think her dad owned coal mines, which in the Victorian era would be like owning oil wells today, you know. And of course, this was in Britain. Britain ruled the world, you know. Steering the British Empire with the coal mines, and that they owned lots of property. But anyway, all the men during the 2 wars, all the men died, the brothers and uncles, and so there were 3 sisters left, and they sold nearly everything and invested the money, and they didn't want to run coal mines or be property managers or any of that. So. But they had one house in Charlton. Before the war, it had been kind of a prestigious neighbourhood, but after the war, probably because of the Blitz, it was a lot less prestigious. But they stayed there. They had a house there, one of these big old Victorian houses, and would give music lessons to the local kids for a pittance. I realise now. Like my in today's money, it'd probably be like $50 a year or something. And my mum would often do tailoring work instead of paying, you know. Mm-hmm. And with most of the violin students, they'd send them through the academics, you know, the Guildhall exams. Mm-hmm. But lots of the kids, if they didn't want to do that, was fine. You know, if they wanted to learn how to play Christmas carols or a bunch of songs to play down the pub or sing along at a Christmas party or something, they'd do that. They were like, she was really old. Do you know Miss Havisham from Great Expectations? Yeah. Well, when I was taking lessons there, especially when I started, that's what she reminded me of. This old woman in a big old dark and imposing house, you know. And I'd have to go there with my fiddle and she'd yell at me and scream at me, sharper, hop board, you know. But she was great. And musically, she was incredibly open-minded. I realise now, you know.
How do you realise that? Like, what was she...
Well, she loved the Stones and the Who and all the modern music. And she used to say, it's great, these kids are making their own music, you know. I mean, they don't need us. They don't need us anymore. They're doing their own thing. It's fantastic, you know. And for a woman like 75 or 80 years of age in 1960, a posh, semi-aristocratic woman, loaded with money, she was supposed to be the complete antithesis of that, a classical music teacher. Like, she's supposed to hate the rock and roll and the Teddy Boys and all that stuff, but she loved it, to the point where she'd sometimes, if a song came on the radio, or she was expecting to hear a song on the radio, she'd sometimes make me wait for my lesson because she wanted to hear the new Who single or something. Oh.
So what were you getting out of it, apart from, so you're learning the basics of the violin and presumably reading music, right?
Yeah. Well, to me, it was just another chore. That, you know, you have to learn how to spell, and you know, one of these things that adults make you do. And I just kind of went along with it. You know, like, you have to make your bed, and you have to polish your shoes, and you have to do your multiplication tables, and, you know, I just went along with it. I didn't really enjoy it. But by the time I got to be 13, 14, I started to get interested in music. You know, fascinated with the sounds. Some of the sounds that I'd hear on the radio, Manfred Mann and the Kinks and all that. My classmates would be talking about stuff like that. But I was also interested in what I was hearing at home on the records and watching these guys come round the house and play, and how everyone seemed to really enjoy this guy, but this other guy, there wasn't the same glee when he played. So what was the difference, And sometimes I'd feel it myself. I thought, this guy's great, but I didn't know why. So I just started to get interested, and I wanted to play. And of course, by the time that happened, I could already play. And I saw it happen to some of my friends in school. They wanted to play too. Play piano or play guitar, mainly guitar. But they didn't really want to learn how to play. They didn't want to do their scales and do their practice. They just wanted to play, And of course, it doesn't really work like that. For most people, you have to learn how to play and put a bit of time in. And a lot of teenagers don't have the patience, They want the end product, but they don't like the route to get there. So they give it up after a while. But by the time that happened to me, I could already do that stuff. I'd spent 5 or 6 years doing these mindless scales and knowing the difference between an up bow and a down bow and learning how to slur notes and, playing Hungarian rhapsodies and, battling my way through Mendelssohn's concerto and stuff like that, And, like a lot of it was tiresome. I had no joy out of it. But after a while, the penny started to drop. But the academic side of the classical playing was so much more grim than the social side of the Irish music. The Irish music had this great social aspect where I'd meet people and have a lot of fun with them and listen to these stories. And of course, they're all immigrants. So what they talked about when they were 10 or 12 wasn't what I was doing when I was 10 or 12. Like they weren't watching TV, watching Top of the Pops on the TV because they didn't have a TV. They were talking about what happened to the donkey when it got stuck in the shed or something like that, I didn't have a donkey. So
that's a really interesting kind of bridging of the experience of going from rural Ireland to an urban Irish experience in London. Yeah. Right? It's really...
Yeah, I used to go and play. I didn't play in the park. I played in the bomb site. My mum would say, "Where are you off to now?" And I'd say, "I'm going up to the bomb site, meet my mates up there." And they'd, "Oh, okay, well, be back for your dinner, And when I think of it now, like the bomb site was just a word meaning a play area. But when I think about it now, it's like, 5, 6 years previous, that was a building.
With people living in it.
Yeah.
Before we have a tune, right? Who are a couple of the players that were in the house that do you remember who particularly that ignited something in you? You kind of thought,
yeah, probably the most shocking, like the most uplifting and inspiring, like in the old-fashioned sense of the word, awesome, was a guy called Brendan McGlinchey. I was completely awestruck when he sat down and started playing. Like that was that opened the door to a whole new world, because I realized this guy is not just poking away at a few tunes. This guy's an expert. Like, there's skill and power and imagination and philosophy and all going on in this fella's playing, Up to then it had just been a bit of crack, It's like, wow, this guy's different calibre altogether. So I hate me one fella, this bloke called Liam O'Hara, who now lives in Connemara, but he was a neighbour of my dad. He grew up in the same village as my dad, a lot younger, of course. There was 2 brothers, Tommy and Ted McGowan from Gurcheen. There was 2 other brothers, Tommy and Eddie Corcoran, also from Gurcheen. There was visiting people. I remember getting up one day and the whole Liverpool Ceilidh band, well, I don't know, was it the whole band, but it must have been at least 7 or 8 of them were asleep in the front room and on the floor, on the sofa. And I remember walking into the room, I could see this big naked arse sticking up over the top of the sofa. So I just shut the door and left. But I can't think now, but there's a few of the people anyway.
Would you do a tune from that kind of period? So I'll need a second just to switch over the microphones here and just figure out the...
Just thinking, I can hear Brendan saying apples and winter. He had a northern accent like you know, and I thought it was so weird. And I remember him saying, "Sound your ah," not sound your a, sound your ah. And he wore winkle pickers. Do you remember them pointed shoes? Yeah. I thought, I don't like this guy wearing winkle pickers. And then he started playing. It's like, wow, this guy's a genius. So probably the first time I heard this tune, it's one of Ed Reevy's. I play it a lot, but I probably heard it that day, the first time I heard Brendan. Should I just start up now?
So what was that tune called?
It's called Maudabon Chapel. It was written by Ed Reevy, who came from Cavan and spent most of his life in Philadelphia. And I'd say in the early 60s, his tunes started to make their way into the standard repertoire. So when I heard Brendan playing it that time, it was probably considered a kind of a new tune, but it's become pretty well known.
So that sort of starts you on sort of recognizing that you're able to pick out playing. Where do you go from there in terms of your own sort of development? Because you start playing around, and did you play around in the dance halls and things?
I used to play at sessions in pubs, and I used to, my parents would bring me to places. Yeah. And again, it was not quite, a lot of these places might not be ideal for a 12-year-old or 13-year-old, but because of the music, it was okay, And my dad being a cop, people would relax when he was with me, because if there was any problem about having a minor in there, he'd say, well, his dad's a cop, like, what are we supposed to do,
You mentioned, I think it might be on the biography on your website about learning tunes from paper.
Yeah.
With your teacher, and then kind of coming to the point where you realise that there's something else going on when you actually hear it.
Yeah, again, you see, my parents weren't musicians, so they couldn't really teach me much other than what they thought was really good and what they didn't think was really good, you know. And in their world, if you could dance to it, it was fine. And if you couldn't dance to it, it was hopeless, you know. That was the gist of it. So anyway, they asked my teacher if she could teach me some Irish tunes, because I was at the point where I could play a tune, but I was learning Christmas carols and, you know, Happy Birthday and stuff like that, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, you know, and my parents said, well, could you teach some Irish tunes? And she said, yeah, he's as well learning that as anything else, but I don't know any, so you have to get me a book. So they got me a book. It was called Alan's Irish Fiddler. And I brought it down to the teacher, and she taught me, you know, whatever the first tune in the book was. And I'd read my way through it and, you know, play it more or less it was written, and of course, I practiced and got a bit better at it, but to my parents' ear, it was almost like the more I practiced, the worse it got. And there was something wrong, badly wrong, but they didn't know what. So they got the teacher up to the house, and they said, now, you know, Kevin's playing Saddle the Pony, and it sounds the way it does, but this is a record of Michael Coleman or Sean Maguire or somebody playing Saddle the Pony, and this is how we're used to hearing it. So she said, but that's not what's written in the book. You know, if you get me a book with that written in it, I'll teach you to play it like that. So that was a big revelation to me, because I didn't realise that wasn't what was in the book. And I realised you have to kind of translate what's on the paper into a noise, especially in Irish music, because the written Irish music is really like a précis, you know, like a shortened, a telegram, as opposed to a conversation. Like when you get a telegram, you'd say, airport, Saturday, 10 a.m, Jack, you know? But if you were talking to the guy, you wouldn't say airport, 10 a.m. You'd say, hey, this is Jack here. I'm flying in Saturday morning around 10 o'clock. Can you pick me up? You know? So the Irish music I discovered is like that. It's like a telegram, and you have to make it into a sentence, and then you have to make it conversational, and you have to make the guy believe you. It's not enough to just relay the message. You got to relay, I really need this lift. It's important that you're there, and if you can't pick me up, then tell me, because I'm going to have to get someone else, you know.
So then you start to learn tunes with your teacher, but you're starting to feel your way into ornamenting and...
Yeah. There was a guy, one of the guys who used to come to the house, Martin McMahon, great accordion player from Clare, fantastic accordion player. He also played the fiddle really well. And I said, you know, when I'm playing, it doesn't sound that good to me. And he says, oh, you're doing grand, you know. I said, well, there's something wrong. And he says, well, you're not putting in any rolls. And I said, what's the roll? And he says, give me the fiddle. And he goes, that's what I mean. And I think, what the hell was that? You know? He just seemed to throw his fingers at the string, and it kind of went... And that's the only lesson I ever had with regard to Irish music. This guy this accordion player showed me on the fiddle how to play a roll.
It's like a wee shiver, almost like you did there.
Yeah. And I remember it took me ages to be able to do it. And I just held my fingers at the string like he did, hoping that the sound would come out. But of course,
and then it's calling on you to listen in a different way too, right? Because you're listening to these players and really picking out, is it a roll or is it something else?
Exactly.
Right? So,
It heightened. I mean, first of all, it made me aware that what you see and what you hear are not necessarily the same thing. And it happens in everyday speech. Like the number of times you hear people saying, well, that's not what I said. And actually it is what they said. But when you read it, it comes off the page differently. Different words take on different amounts of importance. And, you know, I mean, like sarcasm, you can sometimes say, well, that's funny, meaning that's not funny at all. That was horrible, you know. But if you write it down, it's he said it was funny.
So then how do you start playing out more so in the dance clubs? I'm interested in that sort of culture of the dance clubs in London and stuff. That's a whole other sort of scene. So who were you playing with and how did that start?
Well, my dad, my mum and dad used to go to these dance clubs fairly regularly, and they'd bring me along, and I was sometimes asked to sit in when they, you know, when I was really young, I only knew a few tunes, and I might have to leave early because that we'd stay till 10 o'clock, and then it was too late. I'd have to be brought home, you know. So they'd get me up to play for a half hour with them, and you know, half the tunes I didn't know, but they maybe. Well, he knows the geese in the bog. Play that one, you know, that kind of thing, you know.
And this would be a Keeley band, so so a couple of accordions and
a couple of fiddles and flute. There was probably the first group I played with was a group called Gossamer Gale in Hammersmith or Victoria. Yeah, Victoria. They had a dance hall in Victoria on Saturday nights, and we'd go up there. And there was a guy called Johnny Hines, a lovely flute player from Moat. And he played the fiddle as well. And there was a fiddler called John O'Shea, whose family was from Kerry, but I'm not sure if he was born in Kerry or not. He grew up mostly in England. Really good fiddler. And a guy called Tommy McCarthy used to play the box, and you know, a few different musicians would be along, and it was a very safe place to bring kids. Like there was no drink. I think it might have been a semi-pioneer thing. Yeah, they didn't advertise it that way, but most of the people there didn't drink, or if they did, they'd go across the road to a pub and have a couple of pints, you know. But there was no bar in the place. It was like a church hall or something. And it wasn't very commercial.
Was it fun for you playing in that for an audience? You weren't nervous, or?
I was a bit shy, but they were lovely people, and they were very encouraging. Like you were saying about your kids, you know, they were delighted. This London kid is scraping away fiddle tunes, and you know, they're not gonna say no, you can't play. You know, if it was inappropriate, they'd steer me that way, but they'd never make me feel it was inappropriate.
So as you're getting older, you mentioned about going off to college. You know, what were you doing for going to college? What were you thinking about for work? And
well, my A levels weren't good enough. I applied for university and didn't get in, so I went to work in the stock exchange. And after working there for about a year...
Doing what?
I was in an office called Company Announcements, which was probably like a newsroom. In those days, this would be about 1970, computerization was brand new, really. We had punch cards and this room with 2 or 3 big computers, the size of 2 or 3 fridges put together. Probably about 100th of the power of your phone today, But anyway, in those days, anything that was done that would affect the price of the share had to be announced to the stock exchange first, before it was made public. And normally that was a formality. Occasionally it was important, but sometimes it was just they'd post a letter to the newspaper. Say Woolworths was getting a new CEO or something. That might affect the price of the shares, So they would send a letter to us at 2:00. It'd be date stamped, 2:00, and then they'd send the letter to all the press at 2:01. So it was just a formality. But occasionally it was important that we knew about it in advance, because it might cause a big flurry with the market, So my employer was the stock exchange. It wasn't like I wasn't trading or anything. Mm-hmm. In fact, I wasn't allowed to trade because I had all this inside information.
Mm-hmm. So then, what? How do you move from that to?
Well, while I was working there, I was contacted by the body that I applied to university through. I forget what it was called. It's kind of a clearinghouse. And this new course was opening up. And given my previous application and my present job, was I interested in the course? And it was a I forget what it was called. Basically, it was a business course in Hull, in Yorkshire. It was a new course. Would I be interested? So I said, yeah. So I went and did it for a year, and then I left. But I'm meeting some of my classmates in October. It's 50 years ago. We haven't met since,
When you left, right? Is that when you went to Ireland?
God, when I left.
I mean, I know I'm kind of asking you to be very precise about things that happened a long time ago. What I'm trying to get to is just, how does your plan start to develop and you start to think, I'm going to go and try and make a go with this?
I played in a folk group. I was still playing in Cayley bands. Even at college, I'd come home for the weekend or whatever, or for the holidays, and I'd go back and play in the bands. And I was also playing in a folk group. When I was about 15, 16, I met this kid in school, a couple of years younger than me, who asked about the fiddle. He saw me carrying a fiddle. And it turned out he played mandolin himself, and he was interested in folk music. Now, at the time, I didn't know I was playing folk music. I just never called it that. To me, folk music was Joan Baez and Julie Felix and, Simon & Garfunkel, these American people with guitars singing songs, mostly that I didn't find very interesting. I had no idea that Joe Heaney was a folk singer and that all these Irish lads down the pub were singing folk songs. Valley of Knockanua and Crooked Jack and McAlpine's Fusiliers and all that. I had no idea that was a folk song, So this guy, his name was Paddy Bush, and he's the brother of Kate Bush, who later became really famous. But he introduced me to 2 folk singers called Dave and Tony Arthur, who lived across the road from the school. So we'd go and spend lunchtime with them sometimes. And they started bringing me to folk clubs, English folk clubs, which was a whole world I didn't know existed. So I was going to the Irish pubs on Friday night, and I'd go to the English folk club on Saturday night, and I'd go to the Cayley Band on Sunday night, and then some nights I'd go to the Marquee Club in London, which was a famous rock